Oh, by the way, it's Kwaku.
Kwaku? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Kwaku.
yeah, yeah. So
I will remember that from now on. Kwaku.
no problem.
All right, it looks like we're live. So Kwaku, thanks for taking the time to come on my show and have a conversation with me. I really appreciate it. So
Mhm.
before we get started, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a Latter-day Saint or Mormon YouTuber. I make videos about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Um, my my audience is mostly high schoolers and college students, and like even some middle schoolers sometimes, oddly enough. But every once in a while, a boomer gets in there, and I appreciate it a lot. And so, yeah, that's what I do. It's some call it apologetics. I don't know if I like that term. I just call it, I make content, and I try to make it fun.
It's interesting. My demographics are like the exact opposite. I get like 35 to 60 and like no young people on my channel.
Yeah, yeah. I was sort of surprised. I was like, why does this guy want to interview me? But I was like, all right, let's do it. Okay, why not?
So just to jump right in, I'm an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there's any reason to believe in any God. And you're, as a Mormon, you believe obviously in Mormonism and the Christian God. Could you tell us a little bit why we should believe that Mormonism is true?
Um, I don't know if necessarily I can tell you to believe Mormonism is true, right? Um, if you read the Book of Mormon and you make a decision for yourself and you say, I believe this happened, then that's just about it, right? I can argue for the Christian God, but only as much as Christians will let me, because sometimes we're classified as Christian, but by a lot of times we're not. The majority of Christians, at least in America, believe in the triune God, and we don't. Majority of Christians believe God is somewhat immaterial or abstract, and we believe he is material. He's a person. So some people have argued we have different gods. So I mean, the Mormon God and the Catholic God. I can't argue for the Catholic God, but I can argue for the Mormon God, I think.
All right. So you do. Why do you believe it's true? Is it just a feeling you get when you read it, or is it an impression? Is there like, because when I read it, it seems very strange to me. Like when people who are non-Mormon read the Mormon texts and the writings of Jonathan Smith, it seems very strange that he saw these magic tablets and that somehow indicates that God exists. It seems not like the evidence does not meet the burden of the claim. Does that make sense?
Well, so the claim essentially is, if you believe the Book of Mormon is true, then you believe that it was translated divinely, right? So if the Book of Mormon is an authentic record and those people written in it really did live, then Joseph's claim about him being visited by an angel would it would then mean, okay, he was appeared to by an angel, and the three witnesses were also appeared to by an angel, and the eight witnesses also held and saw these plates. And if angels are real, I mean, then we can just assume that there's also a God. By Latter-day Saint doctrine, angels, gods, and humans are all one species, right? Just sort of different levels of glory, if you will. So, if angels are real, then there's a God, right? But also something that might be interesting to keep in note. We're not entirely universalist in this way, but we believe that there is still religious truth outside of our faith. So if someone says, well, does Muhammad's claim of being appeared to by an angel contradict, Mormonism? And our answer is no, right? So Muhammad could have been appeared to by Gabriel, and that still totally works. We're fine with that. Joan of Arc being appeared to by Catherine totally works with us. So there's an exclusivity in terms of authority, but not exclusivity in terms of divine appearances and communion with angels and gods.
Would that also apply to like Hinduism and Jainism, Buddhism, the other kinds of religions? Can they see angels too that are part of their religion?
Yeah. So in 1978, the church released a statement saying that God works with many different people and groups. There's even a part in the I want to say the Bhagavad Gita. Someone's going to fact check me and make me look dumb, but I want to say it's in the Bhagavad Gita where it's Arjuna is appeared to by Krishna, and Krishna says just about the same thing Christ says to Ether in the Book of Mormon, where Arjuna says, "I want to see you," and he says, "I will show you to me I will show myself to you, and I've never shown myself this way to any man before. So even with the scriptures, there's some lineup that seem that can hint to someone that perhaps God, the same God of the Bible, of the Book of Mormon, it can be the same God of these other religions, or they're at least somewhat inspired, and they're also very fallible in other ways.
So are there any claims to seeing angels that you don't believe that you would say are false?
Um, so I mean, I don't necessarily have I'm not gonna go knock on someone's door and be like, let me tell you, Muhammad did see Gabriel, right? Like if he did, it's cool. If he didn't, I don't really care that much. I don't have like a strong like set. I do believe in the restoration of the gospel, as we call it. So beginning with Joseph Smith's first vision, I believe that prophets have seen angels face to face. So I hold firm to that, but things outside of that, it's whatever.
Also, from my position, I know a lot of people who have claimed to see visions and angels and spirits and all those kinds of things. I don't normally believe them. I'm very skeptical of those claims. And so I would say, why should we be not skeptical in the case of Joseph Smith as opposed to being skeptical in these other cases of like this guy on the street who's claiming to have seen demons, just railing at stuff. Like, what's the difference between those two?
Well, I think the difference is you have to look at the impact on society, right? So if some guy who lives in a cul-de-sac says he saw Moses appear to him, then he very well may have, and maybe that's just it. But when someone says, "Hey, I was praying in the woods, and God and Jesus appeared to me around with other heavenly beings. I was then told not to join any churches. I was then appeared to by an ancient Native American angel who gave me plates to translate." Like the claim is so much bigger. And by the time Joseph Smith died, I mean, it was the largest homegrown American religion it was such a threat. They got kicked out of America, had to go west and build their own country, right? So the weight of the claims are different, right? You have one person who might just say something, but then you have someone who might say something, but then you look and you see stuff's actually happening with it. And so, like anything, I live in the Mountain West, and in the Mountain West there's a lot of tech here, and there's a lot of like the summer sales door knocker guys are based out of Utah, and someone can say to me, "Hey, if you can go join my company, and it's going to be great," but they have nothing to show for it. And someone else can say, "You can join my company. We have a lot to show for it." Objectively, you're going to say, "Okay, which one? Maybe both their models are nonsense, but which one should I pay attention to first?" Right? That seems to be, I think, a fair way to look at it.
Sure. So, but if we contrast Mormonism with other religions or people who have claimed to be Jesus, like there's this guy in Russia called Vissarion. He claims to be the resurrection of Jesus, and he has a pretty big following too. Does the fact that he has a big following mean that we should take him seriously? Or other religions like Falun Gong, which is the fastest growing religion ever, does that mean that it has more credibility than Mormonism because it's fastest growing?
No, but I think that there is obviously a reason that that Russian guy has attention, right? So I believe there's a documentary I saw on Vice on YouTube. I believe we might be referring to the same guy,
I
right?
think so, yeah.
Um, because of his following, he has a documentary, and you know about him. If you didn't have a following and nobody cared, you probably wouldn't know who this Russian guy is, right? So the fact that there is a following means we've paid attention and we've considered, right?
Yeah.
Maybe lightly considered, but we've considered more than just some Joe Schmo. So I think of all the religions proposed throughout humankind, or at least let's say the last 500 years, right? Of all the religions proposed around the last 500 years, there's a lot of gods out there. There's a lot of faiths. There's a lot of interpretations of those faiths. Even within the Mormonism movement, there's what I think 400 denominations, right? So of all those things together, you have to say, well, which one's making an impact? And that's the one that you end up talking about. That's the one you end up studying more. Now, of course, whether if an angel appeared to someone, that's not going to make you like whether he's in Russia with 100 followers or in America with 8 million. That's probably not going to make you, Tom, then just believe one of them, right? Like it comes down to if you believe that angels can speak to a person, that's really what's going to make the difference at the end of the day.
Well, even if I accept that angels do exist and can speak to people, why would I believe that Joseph Smith's account was true? I mean, because if I Like if I want to say, if I want to believe something, I want to show that this thing that has been asserted isn't just imaginary. And the first thing in science, what we do is we have to show that whatever we're claiming is true is not one of the imaginary things, because there's infinitely many imaginary ways to explain anything. Like if we saw a cup fall over or whatever, it could be the wind or a squirrel or a bird or someone bumped the table or leprechauns or magic or psychic powers. You could always explain how the cup fell over in infinitely many ways. And so we need some criteria to differentiate what the truth is, the one truth, as opposed to just all the other imaginary things. And when I see the account of Joseph Smith, I don't see any way to differentiate it from all the other accounts that are just imaginary and not the truth.
Um, I mean, I suppose you just have to take, well, one, the scriptures that he's given. So you can examine the Book of Mormon, and you can determine if you believe this was a fraud created in a couple months by a man with an elementary level education, or it was something else. You kind of when it comes to the Book of Mormon, you have about three options. You have three options without getting into conspiracy theories and weeds and things that seem, can like an Alex Jones type stuff, right? So you have about it was divinely inspired, right? A being from above came down and essentially directed him to do this. You have he made it up on the spot via improvisation, or you have we don't know how it got here. It's a Stonehenge. It's perhaps a pyramid, right? We don't know, right? It could be a number of things. There's no solid declaration. Of those three, I picked the angel. I don't find that I don't find it plausible that Joseph Smith could have written the Book of Mormon in those few months he did, with that level of education he did, with the complexity of the Book of Mormon, right? With getting Hebraisms and incredible chiasmus, even getting ancient locations correct in the Arabian Peninsula, like Nahom and Bountiful, getting names right of ancient Eastern teachers of wisdom like Zenock and Zenos that would later be attested to in ancient manuscripts. Just things that seem so unlikely. Then you take into account not just that, but Joseph Smith's prophecies, like predicting the Civil War 30 years before it happens with exactness. I look at these things and I say, I don't know how he could have made that up. I mean, people. There's still people that have Nostradamus on their phones, the apps, and things like that, and they say that's impressive. To me, Joseph Smith is far more impressive than Nostradamus, right? So I look at Joseph Smith's life. I look at the things he produced and claimed and said they were of God, and I have to make a decision. And I say I'm going to go with God instead of a fraud. If he made it up, then he was P.T. Barnum of The Greatest Showman to the 100th power, and I probably still have a lot of respect for someone like that, if they made it up. But it seems to be unlikely that he made it up.
Yeah, that actually would be really good evidence if he could make predictions about things like that we hadn't discovered yet, and then we discover them later. That's good evidence. But could you give me like where did he predict the Civil War? Where did he get these names of these people? Because I'm not familiar with any of those being verified.
Yeah. So I can give that for you. So one of our scriptures is called the Doctrine and Covenants, and it's actually similar to the Quran in a way. It's just a compilation of revelations given to Joseph Smith. And for someone who wants to make sure they're getting all the right information, you can go to the Joseph Smith Papers, which is the original manuscripts of Joseph and other prophets written down, just scanned, so you can read the original and compare it to the modern text we have. Doctrine and Covenants 87 is the same. So we know it is from 1832, and I'll read just a few verses of it because it doesn't take very long. In 1832, Joseph received a revelation that says, "Verily thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls. And the time will come that war will be poured out upon all nations beginning at this place. For behold, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states, and the southern states will call on other nations, even the nation of Great Britain, as it is called, and they shall also call upon other nations in order to defend themselves against other nations." It goes on for a bit, but it gives a pretty striking prediction of the Civil War. even down to the calling of Great Britain, right? Like the even the like specific niche things that happened in the Civil War. So, I mean, Greatest Showman, or maybe he was telling the truth. There's also in the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon, when it begins in Jerusalem, and if anyone who's read it, and Lehi is the first prophet in the Book of Mormon, and his son Nephi, and they leave Jerusalem, and as they're leaving places, they start naming places. So they get to a place, and they call it Shazar as they're going into the desert. But then they get to a place that was already called Nahom, and in Hebrew there's no vowels, right? So it'd be NHM, Nehem. And what happens is one of the people in their camp, Ishmael, he dies there, and he's buried. They bury him at Nahom. And as we know from the Old Testament and from the Torah, the Talmud, the Tanakh, Hebrew utilizes a lot of poetry, right? So the Hebrew word for mourn is nicham, which we don't assume Joseph Smith knew Hebrew at the time he translated the Book of Mormon, right? We don't have any evidence for that. But it seems to be a Hebrew play on words that Ishmael did. Niham met Necham, right? That seems to be the play on words there. But the most interesting thing about that is afterward, the geography of the Book of Mormon directs them nearly eastward to a land called Bountiful, which is a sort of random beach with honey and cliffs and timber and all these things. It's like a pretty paradisiacal kind of beach thing. Well, in the 1990s, German archaeologists found these tribal altars that had NHM written upon them, Nehem, and they found them in a burial site. And these were non-Latter-day Saints who found this tribal altar, this burial site of Nehem. Afterward, you get to the Dhofar region of Oman, and there is this random beach that shouldn't be there that seems to match the description of everything in Bountiful. And so this has been attested to by, Latter-day Saints, non-Latter-day Saints, the burial site of Nahom. Well, it wasn't until a BYU professor found out about this archaeology and said, this is in the Book of Mormon right here. So it's one of those things that seems to be kind of a shocking, okay, interesting enough. I'll give you one more, so I'll end this rant. One more is, in the Book of Mormon, Jacob quotes a prophet named Zenos, and Zenos is talking about the allegory of the olive tree, and basically Jacob kind of says, my life is just like Zenos. Everything that's going to happen to me, it happened to Zenos essentially, and I'm going to liken Zenos' words unto myself. And the claims in the Book of Mormon about Zenos are pretty striking and pretty specific. So I'll read just a few of them here. It says some of the things are Zenos gives a farewell speech when it was near for him to die. Zenos reveals to the people what the Lord would show him what would happen in the last days. Zenos shares the words of his father. Zenos is told that despite the Lord's work, Israel, Zion, the kingdom of God would become corrupt, sort of an apostasy, and a few other things. And all those things I read are from something called Biblical Antiquities by Philo, which was not anything Joe Smith had access to. I'm not even sure if it was translated yet into English. And those things are matched what's in Jacob in the Book of Mormon. Jacob's farewell speech was addressed to an assembly right near his death as he's bringing up that he is just like a Zenos. Jacob prophesies what the Lord would do the second time, in the last days. Jacob retells the words of Zenos about how to continue in the way of the Lord in the straight and narrow, which is what Zenos says in the Biblical Antiquities, to stay in the paths of the Lord. So there's just a bunch of these similarities that, again, I have to say, I don't know if he could have made them up. And they seem to be pretty clear, right? Not open and vague, but pretty clear things.
Yeah, that would definitely be good evidence, but my understanding is that in the historiographers who look at this don't interpret it in the same way. They see there are a lot of challenges with this where it seems like it's kind of vague and being forced to fit the similarities in the past. It's not very explicit in the way that it's compared. And that these texts could have been like written afterwards. They're not the originals, as you said. I don't think when you actually date them that they actually do get to prior to the Civil War. I think they were written after the Civil War in some cases. And a lot of the things Joseph Smith says, like he says, there are certain kinds of animals and tools that existed in Native American history that just didn't exist in North America at that time period, because there's no way they could have, since they couldn't have gotten there in any way. And so there's a lot of challenges that I don't really, even though he could have gotten some things right, there's a lot of things he got wrong. So if you make a bunch of different guesses and get a few right, it's not as impressive.
Well, so on the subject of the Civil War, D&C 87 is the manuscript we have is straight from 1832. So yeah, I encourage your audience to go look up Doctrine and Covenants 87 on Google and type in Joseph Smith papers, and that will take you to the scan of the original document. And it's cursive from antebellum America, so they also have a little manuscript next to it, but it says the same thing. It was not canonized, I don't believe, until after the Civil War, but the actual manuscript of it, even and later attested to statements backing it up, we have very, very clearly documented about 30 years before the Civil War. So this is actually something that is one of the things that's a bit striking. So for those who don't really have much of a ball in the game in terms of being Mormon or being atheist, just people who maybe don't care, just sort of objectively look at it, find this a bit impressive. So you can find a few documentaries on YouTube that are I believe one is from the 90s, late 90s, that was on, I want to say CBS or ABC, talking about Mormons and, like, what is a strange religion that's out there? And one of the things in there is there's a striking prophecy about the Civil War. Weird that he got this right. It's something that's pretty well attested to. You can't find any also altered text. You find that it matches very plainly, very clearly. And Joseph Smith, even when he predicted this, a lot of people thought it was going to happen right away. A couple years goes by and there's no war, and even and newspapers like the San Francisco Golden Era, they're actually mocking Joseph Smith for saying, there's not going to be a civil war. This is ridiculous. The only suggestion about the Civil War prophecy is that Joseph Smith copied it from something called the Painesville Telegraph. And that's really the only answer people can give. And so you have to go read the Painesville Telegraph, and it doesn't say anything even close to what Doctrine and Covenants 87 says.
Well, to give you one example, like in the 1876 sections 101 from the 1835 edition, there was a section was removed, section 101, which is the statement on marriage. So we know there have been revisions, a lot of revisions, more modern, way after the Civil War and lots of things. And so it does seem like we can look at the oldest ones and see that there are differences to the newer ones, and that they have been changed quite a bit in certain cases. Like, I'm just looking at the Wikipedia right now for the Doctrines and Covenants, and it just says that's the first line. It just says here's a statement that was taken out, and here's the exact date and the reference in the academic journal that this was published in.
Yeah, so not all of the things in Doctrine and Covenants are just complete prophecies, right? So some are just directions of what to do in the church. Some are revelation given. And the way we claim that revelation happens in the church is that it comes line upon line. So Joseph Smith would get revelation, and he would say, what's a better way to say that? And then he would go through and change something. So, for example, in the first vision, he originally said it was a pillar of fire, right? And then he said, fire is not really the right word, pillar of light. And then there's sort of an evolution there. The actual foundation and claims of those things are not necessarily changed, just certain small things. And certain things are omitted at certain times periods, but that's more so the work of the church in terms of organization. We even have even parts of the Book of Mormon. There's one verse in the Book of Mormon that says, that's talking about the Nephites, and it used the term white and delightsome. And as Joseph's translating it, he said, I don't actually think that's what the Nephites meant. They mean pure and delightsome. So he had Oliver Cowdery change it as they were translating. Well, that manuscript didn't get published in. It was supposed to be, but then the church gets the ball rolling and they go west. And it wasn't until the 1980s that it was discovered, and they were able to then change the Book of Mormon to match what Joseph Smith really wanted it to say, as he felt was the appropriate translation. So we believe that within our doctrine, within our claims, as the prophet, you get to make the call if you need to change something, right? If the Nephites wrote something down that should have been that made sense to them, but would be different the way we interpret it, he has the right to change.
But weren't
Um,
there a lot of changes made after Joseph Smith by more recent Latter-day Saints ministers? And so it wasn't just him who made the changes.
well, the majority of the Book of Mormon changes are punctuation. So the Book of Mormon is written without punctuation. It's just one long run-on sentence. And the only really doctrinal changes you can find in the Book of Mormon are things like Jesus Christ, the eternal God, being Jesus Christ, the Son of the eternal God. Right? You can say Christ is the eternal God because he's the God of our salvation, but you also say he's the Son of God because he is the Son of the Father. So just for clarification, they went and added in Son of God. Right? Either term works, but because we're trying to make ourselves more distinct from the rest of the Christian world, we can put in Son of God here. So this is specifically speaking about the Lord. This is specifically speaking about Heavenly Father. Not really too big of deals. So with, I believe you're talking about Doctrine and Covenants 76 on the Wikipedia page. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what that change is referencing. But that's also not a prophecy, Doctrine and Covenants 76. But Doctrine and Covenants 87 is very clear a prophecy that came true. But to respond to the Book of Mormon, what we find with the Book of Mormon in terms of things that shouldn't be there, or anachronisms, right? So when the Book of Mormon was first published, the list of anachronisms was pretty long. Now it's not that long. So, for example, one of the biggest anachronisms of the Book of Mormon was elephants, right? There are elephants in the Book of Mormon. Well, there could not be elephants in the Book of Mormon. Well, elephants are only mentioned in one place in the Book of Mormon. That's in the Book of Ether. The Book of Ether takes place during the Tower of Babel, and it's essentially a small group of people sail to this continent right after the Tower of Babel, and that time period is around the only time period in which mammoths were ever actually on this continent. The Book of Mormon never makes a claim that elephants were walking around America during the time of the New Testament or the even murder of the Old Testament, right? Just that very specific ancient time period in which there were mammoths here. So what was an anachronism is not an anachronism for elephants. And some things just have never been anachronistic to the Book of Mormon. So pigs, for one, they say pigs are in the Book of Mormon, shouldn't be. Well, there are, or swine rather. Well, there are pigs that are native to the Americas. They're called javelinas. They're called peccaries. You go to Mexico, Texas. I mean, they're there. They're native here. Things like goats, mountain goats, native to the Americas. Sheep, bighorn sheep, native to the Americas. So the list of anachronisms, if you really, isn't that good of a list. When you read objective criticism on the Book of Mormon, because the majority of criticism of the Book of Mormon is going to be either, don't disrespect yourself, very, very atheistic, trying to disprove religion, or very evangelical Christian, trying to say that we're not real Christianity. But if you get things from Oxford University Press or even Harvard, just these sort of scholarly looks at the Book of Mormon, they kind of say, look, our job isn't to say whether this is true or not. You know, like we're professors and scholars. We're not religious teachers. We're not pastors. But we can say that certain criticisms of the Book of Mormon are no longer valid in 2019. So the list of anachronisms is much smaller today, as it should be, right? So one criticism of the Bible has been that there are lions written in the Bible where lions shouldn't have existed. So lions in Israel, at the time they weren't there. It wasn't until the late 1990s that lion bones were discovered in Israel that then validated, okay, so there are some parts of the Bible in which lions could have been there, right? So just because you haven't found it yet doesn't mean you won't find it. With the Book of Mormon, we find that the trend is the longer the Book of Mormon's around and the more access we have to archaeology and the better archaeological excavations we do, we find that the anachronistic list gets a lot shorter.
Well, from my understanding, it's still pretty long. Like saying horses were in certain kinds of horses and cattle and things were in North America with the Indians when they just biologically didn't exist at that time period. It seems pretty hard to say that that's an accurate historical statement when we've excavated the areas pretty thoroughly and found no such thing even coming close to those.
So there are about two answers. One, there was, well, I guess there's three answers. So there have been horse bones found in the Yucatan and in Mexico that are pre-Columbian. Um, the other answer is in the Book of Mormon, horses are mentioned along with chariots, but they're not actually mentioned pulling chariots, and that's actually an important distinction because Aztec and Maya art have uh, there's often art of kings and chiefs being hoisted upon chariots with animals running next to those chariots. So that suggests that there's a little bit more, digging to do there. However, horses in the Book of Mormon are usually just great eating grass, or they're being used for food. So it brings into question, what animal did Joseph see? There are animals in the Book of Mormon time period which are now extinct. When Joseph was translating, what animal did he see? Just what we do when we name animals is we use a system that's a bit flawed, but we're used to it. So we name animals what they look like. So sea lions aren't actually sea lions. A seahorse isn't actually a seahorse. A meerkat isn't even a cat, right? Hippopotamus means water horse or water hog in Greek. So for Joseph to say horse, either there just were horses. Where we found horse bones that are pre-Columbian in the Americas, which we didn't know there were before, or it wasn't a horse. It was rather an animal that Joseph Smith just said, it's a horse. Like, for all intents and purposes, it's a horse. Because there's also two animals mentioned in the Book of Mormon called Kurlams and Kumams. Nobody knows what they are. We have no idea what a Kurlam or a Kumam is. So you kind of have, it's almost like an unwinnable battle, right? If there's an animal and we're not quite sure what it is, either you name it something that's similar to what it would be, like a horse, or you just give it the name, the English translation of what the Nephites had, and you call it a Kurlam and a Kumam, and we don't know what it is. So it's kind of, you can't win, right? Either way, like, you call it something we would understand, or you call it what it is and we don't know what it is, and people can criticize either.
Well, sure, that could definitely apply to certain examples, but some of the things he mentions, like steel, bellows, brass, gold, breastplates, chains, irons, plows, swords, scimitars, chariots, none of those existed. I mean, I don't know if you can really use those in a general sense to apply to something else, because they don't really have that kind of general usage. They really seem to apply to certain things which definitely didn't exist at the time period.
So one problem is that certain things in the Book of Mormon, like you mentioned, so steel and even things like silk, we have a very, how do I say this, a very European definition of what those have to exactly be. So what we know from ancient America is that there were metals used, right? So we don't know if it was steel, but again, we're just talking about a translation of an ancient record.
Well, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think American Indians had access to metal. They didn't have a smelting capability. They used rocks for the most part.
So I would say that the newest archaeology would contradict that. So newest archaeology, I would say, and the newest scholarship, I would say, is moving away from that model. And in fact, the newest scholarship is moving away from the model that ancient Native Americans were smaller in population and were not as industrious as we know. So National Geographic last year, for example, came out with a new study about how in Guatemala, in ancient Guatemala, there are about 50,000 more people living there than previously thought. They used LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, and they found highways, they found roads, they found fortresses, they found more civilization than they thought before. Now, these are all unique Book of Mormon claims, right? Highways being cast up, many roads going through cities. There were fortresses. There are like higher military grade weapons than we thought. So this was only last year that this was officially went public, right? And so it was a really big deal. Again, wasn't Mormons who launched this. This was just people trying to figure out what is going on in Central and South America and what has been here before, because we don't really know, unfortunately, due to historical genocide and all these terrible things that happened in those parts of the world. So the newest scholarship is, I mean, it's getting there to the point where I don't think you can confidently say they did not have metals. The newest
Oh,
scholarship.
yeah, I apologize. They definitely had metals, but things like steel specifically, because he does make a difference. Joseph Smith does make a difference between iron and steel. He uses the two terms differently. And steel, just they did not have the technological capability to create enough heat to weld the steel. It's not physically possible for them to have done that. They definitely had
Well,
like gold and silver and bronze and that kind of stuff, brass.
so I mean, we. I guess I would say. I mean, I'm not an expert on steel, right? So I can't. I'm just not an expert on steel. But I will say that was the same claim about Book of Mormon cities and warfare 10 years ago. That it was impossible. That ancient Americans were not advanced enough, did not have the technological capabilities to create fortresses or to create highways. It wasn't there, and we find that well, they did, and it was there.
Right. I mean,
So,
I definitely I wouldn't say that because I definitely say war and buildings have existed for long before the Bible, tens of thousands of years before the Bible. But chainmail and breastplates and steel and certain kinds of metals, we know exactly when those were created because we know the technological limitations required to produce them. And the early Americans didn't have those. We know for a fact they didn't have those because they couldn't. They didn't have the technological capability to build them. So like breastplates, not out of iron and chains. Nope. They just couldn't do it.
um, so for one, so chains in the Book of Mormon are only referenced in Second Nephi in the Isaiah chapters. So it's when they're quoting Isaiah. And the only time outside of the Book of Mormon chains are mentioned is with Lehi and Nephi, who just left Jerusalem. So the Book of Mormon isn't making a claim that ancient Native Americans even actually had chains. It's referencing the old world. Um,
You sure? Because we're looking at the Wikipedia right here, and it's listing all the things that they mention in the pre-Columbian Americas, and the chains, ironworking, plows, storage. Those are all listed among the things in.
I wouldn't trust Wikipedia. I would I yeah I know I wouldn't trust Wikipedia on a lot of things.
Well, this is actually from the Smithsonian. This the quote they use is from the Smithsonian Institute statement on the Book of Mormon Institute for Religious Research, archived on May 20th, 2012. So they're just copying from the Smithsonian Institute.
So right, so I believe I know what you're talking about. I would like to because if it's from the Institute of Religious Research, that's actually specifically anti-Mormon website, which will quote things but not actually quote things. So um, this is so the National Geographic and the Smithsonian have just about the same letter, and they've actually changed it throughout time because they're not here to make an actual piece about what the Book of Mormon says. So I can actually find the um, full statement for you.
Yeah, and you
Okay,
also
here.
mentioned that you found horse fossils, because from my understanding, the horses were introduced by the Spaniards many years later. So I don't, I'm not familiar with any archaeology that shows that there's horse fossils prior to that.
Um, yes, so I'll mention that right after this. The Smithsonian statement says your recent inquiry concerning the Smithsonian Institute's alleged use of the Book of Mormon as a scientific guide has been received in the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology. The Book of Mormon is a religious document and not a scientific guide. The Smithsonian Institution has never used it in archaeological research, and any information that you have received to the contrary is incorrect. Accurate information about the Smithsonian's position is contained in the enclosed statement regarding the Book of Mormon, which is prepared to respond to the numerous inquiries because the Smithsonian receives on this topic. Because the Smithsonian regards the unauthorized use of its name to disseminate inaccurate information as unlawful, we would appreciate your assistance in providing us with the names of individuals. So basically, it says, I mean, it's not actually saying this is why the Book of Mormon is impossible. It's saying this is a religious book. We don't use it to validate things. It's just we're not going to go and say this is true, not true. So the Wikipedia page will be listing here are some things that are making untrue, and here's a link of the Smithsonian saying they don't use it. I mean, it's not really a you won't find a document from the Smithsonian, at least not public that I'm aware of, that says this is why the Book of Mormon is impossible,
Oh,
right?
right,
So
right. They would never say that, but they do say that there were none of those things that the Book of Mormon lists existed in that time period. They don't specifically say, therefore, the Book of Mormon is wrong. They're just saying these
right.
things didn't exist in that time period.
I mean, that list even the Smithsonian doesn't have. They'd have there's no public document I'm aware of that lists that. So from the Wikipedia page, they're listing things that they believe. So ancient Americans didn't have chains, but the Book of Mormon doesn't actually claim they did. Um, so again, it's another thing. Why would the Book of Mormon mention elephants in pre-Columbian America? Well, the time period it actually mentions elephants are far beyond what we're thinking. There's even things like bees in the Book of Mormon, right? I mean, it's a pretty silly. I mean, people say we have no bee fossils. There were no bees in America before Columbus, or I mean, that's also a pretty weak stance. But even the Book of Mormon doesn't really actually mention bees being in the Americas. Big portion of the Book of Mormon is reflecting back on the Old World, so there are unique things named that are unique to the Old World that are not claimed to be held by the ancient Native Americans. So, with a good reading of the Book of Mormon, you can find the distinctions between the two.
Oh, and
Um,
I wanted to comment on what you said earlier that the Smithsonian never said anything specifically about the Book of Mormon. Well, they actually did. In that same paper you were just reading, the next page, they specifically say the iron, steel, glass, and silk were not used in the New World before 14 or whatever number that is. I can't read it. The occasional use. So it specifically says that no, none of these things were in the exact same paper you were just reading, like two paragraphs later.
right, and okay, I think I'm actually saying this here. Oh, okay, right. Well, this is from 1988. So this actual statement itself is not the same, right? So,
What?
for example, um, barley has been attested to now in ancient America that wasn't before in 1988. Um,
This paper is published in 1997. The thing where it said your recent inquiry into the concerning the Smithsonian Institution, blah 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 blah. That was all 1997.
right. Okay. So no. So this is 1997. I believe the first. I don't actually see the date on the first one. I just see the statement regarding the Book of Mormon, a list of things that they believe may be problematic, but that's actually from 1988. So most recent scholarship would even disagree with. So the Smithsonian today would disagree with the Smithsonian in 1988, right? I mean, any.
Well, yeah, pretty much anybody would from that long ago because there's a lot of new
So
things. But I mean, the one I'm looking at specifically says 1996, 1997 on every page.
the one I'm looking at says 1998. 1988 rather.
Yeah,
So
1990, mine are all 90. So yeah, I'd agree with 1998, but 88, no.
yeah, this says I can show you a picture if you'd like.
Yeah,
But yeah, it says 1988. But even so, right? It wasn't until last year that we discovered how ancient Guatemala was just worlds different than we thought it was 10 years ago. So, I mean, if the one of the biggest arguments people use against the Book of Mormon is, well, we haven't found it yet, or we don't think it's possible yet. To me, that's not strong enough, especially because the trajectory of the Book of Mormon is these things seem to be true the more research we do throughout time. So again, uh, it's very unlikely that Joe Smith would get the name of a burial site, a name of two places right. He would get two places right that he'd never been if he was just making it up. It's very unlikely. You don't just guess ancient burial sites called Nahom in the Arabian Peninsula as a New York farm boy with an elementary education as you're translating with a rock and a hat. You just don't do that. So the other thing to keep in mind is that the majority of criticisms we have about the Book of Mormon, at least in regard to ancient Native Americans, are based off of 19th century prejudice. So this is one that it gets peddled around a lot about how it was Native Americans didn't have access to certain tools. Well, honestly, I think it's Mark Wright, who's a Mesoamerican archaeologist, says we discovered about 0.1% of ancient America. We don't have much discovered. We haven't done the level of archaeology that we've done in the Middle East or even in Europe for that matter. We don't have really anything. And so, I mean, we're trying to make very bold claims and prove or disprove ancient documents based upon very limited information. I'm not an archaeologist. I don't think you are. So really, it's neither of our fields. But from what we can say about the Book of Mormon, with the limited amount we have, we've got some good stuff. If it was made up, we wouldn't have those things. If it was
Well,
made up,
wait a minute, because if we look at other historical documents like the Iliad and the Odyssey, we can say that a lot of the things written in those books, we can say the same thing about. Like there's a lot of true things in there, but there's also a lot of false things. And we don't consider them to be historically accurate just because some of the stuff it says is true. We don't,
well, I don't think the Iliad and the Odyssey have direct locations named that weren't discovered like until hundreds and hundreds of years after,
well, they were
right?
written by an ancient Greek guy. So, I mean, they definitely did, but my point
No, no,
is that,
like so it's if the Iliad cannot be true, right? And you can say we went to Athens or whatever, and then we'll maybe we just didn't know Athens, right? I don't know. And then we say, oh, look, Athens is real. That's much different from 19th century. Hey, and then they went to Nahum. Here's the burial site, and we go, oh, that's actually attested to anciently, right? I mean, they're pretty different because one is a work of the past, mentioning the past, but without the religious lens, the Book of Mormon is a modern work that's attested to anciently that shouldn't be if it is a fraud.
right, but
Um,
my point is just that we take any historical document at all and we see that it has some true things that doesn't, we don't then say, well, the other things it says are also true. So like the Iliad and the Odyssey mentions things like Troy and Troy existed, but it also mentions things like Cyclops and Sirens. We don't grant that the Cyclops and Sirens are true just because we know Troy is true. So even if we grant some of the things are true in Joseph Smith's testimony, that doesn't mean we should give the other claims also credence just because some of the things are true for the same reason.
but I mean, obviously, there's a big difference between um, cyclopses and burial sites, right? If the Book of Mormon was saying, "Hey, guess what? I went to the southeast side of Jerusalem and saw the synagogue of the star, and we discovered that there's a synagogue with a star in the southeast corner." Then he says, and that's when the goblins came and tried to steal the moon. You would go, okay, he's all right. It's nonsense. But the claim isn't that. The claim is very specific geography, um, and the most outlandish claims of the Book of Mormon are nothing to the level of of orcs, right? I mean, the most outlandish claims of the Book of Mormon that are criticized are horses and wheat. I mean, just not the same level, right? It's far more likely, I think we would both admit, that horses existed in the Americas. We just haven't discovered it yet with the limited amount of archaeology and excavation we've done than orcs have ever existed in this world, right? It's what one is much more likely than the other. So I don't think they're the most fair comparisons.
Well, yeah, I was making the broadest generalization there possible, but when he says that there's certain kinds of technology that didn't exist until thousands of years later, that would be like if I said back in the 1600s they had a quantum computer or something. Like that's a pretty ridiculous claim. It's pretty hard to accept that, and that's the kind of claim he makes, which is why I was trying to compare it to like orcs and things, because it's not as cut and dry as you make it seem. Like, oh, we just haven't discovered the archaeological ability to do that yet. It's like that technology just hasn't existed, and just to be able to build that technology would take hundreds of
And,
years. What?
and you're specifically referring to steel
Yeah, the thing the
being the
Smithsonian mentions glass and steel and
um,
iron, steel, glass, silk.
right. So
Breastplates.
what I know from I can say this the idea that steel steel is even anachronistic to the Bible is really not like steel and iron. These things are actually not true. So they found a carburized iron sword near Jericho, which dates about 600 BC. Matt Roper notes this. More significant, perhaps, in relation to the sword of Laban, archaeologists have discovered a carburized iron sword near Jericho. The sword, which had a bronze haft, was 1 meter long and dates to the time of King Josiah, who would have been a contemporary of Lehi. This find has been described as spectacular, since it's apparently the only complete sword of its size. These were anachronisms. They find that, oh, perhaps they're not. So again, the steel in the Book of Mormon, like we talked about, steel being something that is translations being something that may be different, but we liken them to our understanding. Just like in the Book of Mormon, there's Ziph and Kurlums and Kumlums. We don't really know what those are, but whatever type of metal they use, it's fine to call it steel. It's okay because maybe steel was there. Again, we haven't done nearly enough excavation. Absence of evidence, not evidence of absence. Steel being possible more in the ancient world is I just don't think there's anything to the level of computers or things like that. Especially because even if we went to ancient Asia or ancient Europe, we're still finding out things today that really do surprise us. So if the Book of Mormon is using the word steel as a placeholder for a certain type of metal, that's fine. The other thing is, how would Joseph Smith know the difference? So if he's translating, right, and let's say he sees or whatever it is in the stone, and it's a certain metal, I think it's fine for him to say steel, right? I mean, either he has to say steel or he has to use whatever ancient American word the Nephites used for it, in which case we don't know what it is anyway. And so then the criticism could be Joseph Smith was pulling a Dr. Seuss and making up words as he went along while translating the Book of Mormon, right?
Well, then, because why did he make a distinction? Because he actually did say that he used steel and iron and brass in different cases. So why would he use the word steel there at all if he couldn't tell the difference between the two?
Well, it's similar because in our church, we also use the term Elohim to describe the Father and Jehovah to describe the Son. But you could use, theoretically, you can use the term Jehovah to describe either the Father or the Son, or Elohim to be the Father or the Son. We use these terms for distinctions in our theology. Just you can know that these things were separate. So, in regard to steel and iron is possible. Magnetite, iron. Was in the ancient Americas. Whether they were pulling it out and making it into things, again, I'm not an expert on metallurgy in among ancient Indians, so that might be out of both of our pay grades. But like we said, it seems to be the trajectory is that these things are getting more discovered and making a blank statement that it's impossible for the Book of Mormon to have this doesn't seem. To me, that seems wishful thinking. It doesn't seem to line up with what we're discovering as time goes on.
Right. I guess that's a fair interpretation, if you want to call it that. Another criticism I hear often is that Joseph Smith's interpretation of the Book of Abraham, when we compare it to actual translations of linguists, seems to be off by quite a bit.
Yeah, to me, that's always been a weird one. In terms of like weird criticism, because to me, I think it's if the Book of Mormon is true, right? If the Book of Mormon is true, then that means Joseph Smith was speaking to angels and God and had revelation given and stuff like that, right? It's if the Book of Mormon's true, it's a totally different ball game. So if it's very unlikely that someone would say, you know what, I'm going to read the Book of Abraham. Let's see if it's true, and if it matches this manuscript, that means Mormonism is true. That's also pretty, obviously, even as an atheist, you wouldn't agree with that. So Joseph Smith translating the book of Abraham is different than the way he translated the Book of Mormon. It wasn't given to him by an angel with plates. He purchased it from Michael Chandler, who was selling manuscripts along with I believe mummies in the Americas, and he bought it and got revelation to translate it. It was used as inspiration for something else. To me, it doesn't. Joseph Smith could have translated from a ramen noodle packet to get the Book of Abraham. It wouldn't really bother me. It's the claim is if it was the initial claim, right? If it was Joseph Smith came and said, "I'm forming a new church. God and Jesus told me not to join any of the other churches, and I have the Book of Abraham here," and that was the first claim, and it was based upon something faulty, I would then go, all right. But it seems to be Book of Mormon, other revelations, Book of Moses, Book of Abraham. What Joseph Smith's life is claiming as time goes on is that he's getting revelation easier and easier, and God is unveiling his will through different means. So it doesn't actually need to be like, to me, the Book of Abraham is not the prime thing you should criticize. It's more of the Book of Mormon, right? If the Book of Mormon is true, then that means we live in a world in which angels appear to people, seer stones can work, and people can become gods. So translating an ancient document to be something else for inspiration really is not that big of a deal.
Yeah, for me, it just seems like if we look at the things he did, they're essentially just like no different from any other human. He's equally as fallible as other humans, which means like why should we believe him in the other cases? That's from my interpretation. It seems like he's just another human doing human stuff.
Oh, and he was definitely a human, right? He was definitely fallible. But the difference is, um, do you know anyone who predicted the uh, I don't know, who predicted the Iraq War 50 years before with incredible accuracy? Any religious leader who did that? No,
Well, actually, a
right?
lot of people predicted it, but they usually predict it often. People predict wars are going to happen like every year, just like they predict the world's going to end every year. So somebody had predicted it.
Let me say this. Let's say it's 1950, and a guy gets on the radio and he says, um, in 2001, terrorists are going to fly a plane into the World Trade Center, and that will spark off a war in the Middle East. And it happens, you would go, wow, it was pretty specific. Now, if you just said there's going to be war with the Middle East, well, when has there not been? That's not that impressive. But the specificity of it is what's impressive, right? So again, you when it comes to Joseph Smith, I always say read the Book of Mormon first. If the Book of Mormon is true, then it separates itself, and that's something you can say, well, if the Book of Mormon is true, then there's something here. Because it's with Joseph Smith's life, even with things like Doctrine and Covenants 87, like we've seen, or things like Zenos or Nahum, or these things in Mormon scripture, which are bullseyes. You have to say, if Joseph Smith was a fraud, this is a level of guessing that is unreal, right? This is a level of guessing that we don't see, that is not similar to the Iliad or the Odyssey, right? This is a level of guessing that is on the nose. So it's different. If I said, hey guys, I was appeared to by the ghost of Farrah Fawcett, but it happened in Newport, and then someone goes, well, Newport exists, therefore he's appeared to by the ghost of Farrah Fawcett. Well, that's nonsense, right? But if I said, hey guys, I was appeared to by an angel in the land of Majinaga, and then we go, okay, well, nonsense. And then 50 years later, they find, hey, this is the city of Majinaga. We can't find anything that shows that Kwaku knew where this was. Also, there seems to be like angelic rituals and legends here as well. That would then make you go, let's look into it a little more, right? So the weight of the claims are different, and the evidence later on that can be attested to those claims make you have to answer the question, was he making it up? Or was he telling the truth, or do we not know? And as a Latter-day Saint YouTuber, you know, I get to talk to a lot of people and things like that. And the answer when you read good scholarship is, I don't know. It seems to be a growing answer. Mormonism, I'm not supposed to use the term Mormonism, but I am. Mormonism is different from a lot of religions. Objectively speaking, we're the most polytheistic religion that exists, because we believe everyone can become a god, right? I mean,
Well,
we beat the
not exactly,
Jews.
because Hinduism has up to 3 million gods at least in that context, just for like just for different things like fire, water, air. So I think they would still technically qualify as more polytheistic, because people can also become gods in that one too. But yeah, it's definitely up there.
That's fair. We're in the top 10, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're not a normal faith. We don't really get invited to the backyard hangouts with the other Christians. We're too Christian for the Eastern Asiatic religions. We're just our own thing. It seems to work though. It seems to be something that people have to wonder and marvel and go, I'm very confused by it. Richard Dawkins recently said on Joe Rogan that the success of Mormonism depresses him, which I thought was funny, because people look at it, and because a lot of people don't have the right information, and so they look at it and they go, this is an obvious fraud. And they say they wear magic underwear and they do such and such and such and such. How do all these people belong to the church? And you got to say, are all of these people really just crazy and dumb, or is there something here? And to me, I think the more likely answer is that there's something there, as opposed to just all these people are dumb, right? I'm not getting political, but you look at someone like Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney is a very intelligent man, very successful businessman. And then I had conversations with people who were like, yeah, Mitt Romney, that guy's a Mormon. He's an idiot. And I'm like, Mitt Romney is way smarter than you. Like, Mitt Romney is an incredibly smart guy. People can't balance this idea that to them, they see Mormonism just has to be this obvious fraud. And then they say, these are not stupid people. There's something different about this. It seems to be that some claims of the Book of Mormon, which are very unique, that should be complete nonsense, are being attested to now. So, I mean, that's in regard to your first question ever, why do I believe in God or gods? I go to that. I don't jump to the moral, well, if there's no God, then, you know, the question you're asking doesn't even matter because you wouldn't even be here. And, you know, I don't do that. I just say, look, do you believe that there is anything outside of this world? Is there life on other planets at all? At any point, has life on other planets ever communed with our planet or interact with our planet? If so, that's a walk in the direction of Mormonism. Stephen Smoot says that in regard to how the Mormon God is who he is, he says there's really nothing supernatural about it. When Joseph Smith said all spirit is matter, he threw supernaturalism out the window. Michael Shermer, there's a great conversation on YouTube between Michael Shermer and Daniel Peterson. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. You probably are because Michael Shermer is a pretty big atheist.
I've seen a lot of them. I don't know which one specifically that one is.
Well,
What was his name? Michael Shermer and who?
Daniel Peterson. He's a professor at BYU, and they're talking about God. And some guy asks Shermer, who says, okay, what if you found evidence that the Red Sea parted or something like that? And he goes, yeah, I see where you're going with this. Well, honestly, I know Penn and Teller, and they can do just about anything that's in the Bible. So to me, it's not that big of a deal. And he says, but even if we were seeing incredible miracles and things like that, that could just be evidence of, you know, some highly intelligent extraterrestrial beings. You know, it's not unlikely that there are beings on other planets or even universes, and one could get to a level of technology and understanding that they could actually interact with this world. That's not impossible. It could just very well be that. And so then the guy said, so naturally, you would get to the idea that there is a God on a different planet in a sense. That's like some sort of alien. And
Wait,
he
how would
goes,
you get to there? Because even if I grant, because I believe aliens do potentially exist. I don't think they've necessarily visited the planet, but I definitely believe in aliens. But even if we grant aliens, why would that lead to the idea there's a God on another planet?
well, it's essentially that there are beings with higher intelligence out there. Right. I'm using God in a very loose sense here.
All right.
Not saying this is means Islam's true. Right. I'm saying God in the loose sense, like God as in Superman is a God, right? There it is a God to us, an angel, whatever word you want to use. He said naturally under that umbrella of examination, there gets to a certain degree where there would be a godlike creature out there. And so he looks at Dan Peterson, he says, but that's not what you guys believe in. And Dan Peterson says, well, you'd be surprised, because essentially that is the God of our religion. If you read the King Follett discourse, Joe Smith talks about how God became God, and he said God was a man first lived on a planet and eventually was elevated to a level of being and intelligence that made him a god. So again, the Mormon God is not where it's not the evangelical God. I mean, I say that in debate mode. I mean, I think it's all the same gist of the same person. But
Well, could you tell me a little bit more about that? Because from my understanding, the idea of the Christian God is that it was first. It was the first thing to ever like exist, essentially. But if the God of Mormonism was a human and then became a god later, then wouldn't the thing that existed before him be counted as the God, the true God?
oh no. So this is this is the most fun doctrine. So I'll just quote it. Um, Essentially, this is in the King Follett discourse. It is one of the last big sermons Joe Smith ever gave about the nature of God. It's pretty remarkable, and I'll find the quote for you so you can know exactly. And okay. He says this. Um, I want you all to know God, to be familiar with him, and if I can bring you to him, all persecutions against me will cease. You will know that I am a servant, for I speak as one having authority. What sort of being was God in the beginning? Open your ears and hear, all ye ends of the earth, for I'm going to prove it to you by the Bible. I'm going to tell you the designs of God for the human race and why he interferes with the affairs of man. First, God himself, who sits enthroned in yonder heaven, is a man like one of you. That is the great secret. If the veil were rent today, you will see the great God who holds this world in its orbit and upholds all things by his power. You would see him in the image and very form of a man, for Adam was created in the very fashion image of God. He received instruction and walked and talked and conversed with him as one man talks to another. Wait, I mean, here is where he says,
What? What does it say?
sorry, I'm getting the best version. There's 5 different versions of it. I'm getting the most attested to one. Um, okay, there's about 5 different PDFs I have in front of me. Essentially, he says that God was a man before he was God. Just that Christ was a man before he was God as well. Oh, here we go. Okay, hear then eternal life. You know only one is true God. You've got to learn how to become gods yourselves, to be kings and priests to God, the same as all gods have done, but going from a small degree to another, from grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation, until you're able to sit in glory as do those who sit enthroned in everlasting power. That's just from one of the PDFs. There are a couple different a couple different people wrote it down. It's a little bit different each time, but the same in each one. That we don't know anything about how our God was before he was a God. We just know he was a man on the planet, based on the King Follow Discourse and teachings of Joseph and Brigham. And because of that, someone could say, well, then he was created by a God, perhaps. What do we know of that God? We don't know. It could have been a totally different system, right?
Yeah, it
God
said that all gods started off small and grew, right? That was one of the quotes.
Yeah, but that could also mean a couple different things, right? Doesn't mean that our God was a savior like Jesus before. We don't know. Does it mean that our God was maybe just a prophet? We don't know. Was he just a normal person? We have no idea, right? The list of everything it could be is pretty open. Someone has even said that the first God evolved. It was an evolution of matter in the universe that then was something that could become a creator of, I don't know, right? I mean, the limit is, it's like a boy. What's that movie, The Avengers, where they have the wizard guy who like can see all the different, right?
Yeah.
It could be something like that, right? We have no idea
So Doctor
how.
Strange, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna get roasted in the comments for not being a good superhero guy, but still, it's one of those things. The limits are, I mean, there's millions of possibilities of how our God became a God. But again, we don't believe in sort of an immaterial, omnipresent, triune God. We believe that it's a person up there.
Well, doesn't that
Richard,
contradict with the Bible where it says, I am the I am the Alpha and the Omega, I created the heavens and the earth, that kind of thing? Because wouldn't that mean that he was created from something else?
yeah. So, got to be careful with my language here. In the Bible, it uses language like that. So, for example, Alpha and Omega is poetic, right? So you say God, Jesus is the beginning and the end, but obviously Christians don't believe Jesus is going to have an end, right? So it means Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, means like I am your creator and your authority, right? From the creation of the world to Judgment Day, I've been here the whole time. But to say that there are no other gods beside or before me or anything like that, I think that's a misreading of the Bible, because you can look at ancient Assyrian and Egyptian literature and poems and hymns where they use the same language about their pharaohs and gods too, right? About the Pharaoh Senwar that says, you are the only pharaoh we see. There's no pharaohs besides you. The great Cairo hymn to Amun-Ra says like you are the sole God, unique like whom of the gods you made all that exist, but they also believed in other gods, right? Jews of the Bible, they had a covenant with Yahweh, but they didn't deny the existence of other heavenly beings or a host of deity. So it's not, it doesn't really contradict. It also says the same thing about Nineveh, right? There's no other cities besides Nineveh, but there just were, right? So it's like a covenantal kind of ancient hype language. So I think it works pretty well within Mormonism. Michael Heiser writes a lot about Psalm 82 and the divine council there, and it seems to be the really modern Christian scholarship that's trying to just give the most objectively good scholarship it can about ancient Judaism. The Bible seems to well, it seems to line up pretty nicely with what Joe Smith said, taught in the Book of Abraham about the Council of Gods.
Would you
Um,
say the same thing about the quotes in Isaiah where God says, "There is no God before me, none after. I know no other." Those kind of things. So it's more of like a figure of speech or figurative, not a literal thing.
yeah, and the reason we know that is because it seems to be the same language paralleled and sometimes even quoted in other openly polytheistic ancient religions, right? So if ancient Egyptians were saying the same thing, and ancient Jews were finding out did believe in other heavenly deities, only covenanted with one, it seems to be that it's a way to keep the children of Israel um, or the covenant people in line and not follow after idols or false gods, but to stay within the line. I'm the only one. However, they also believe in exaltation. They would become a god. And the divine council in the Bible, there's really two ways to look at it. One is a council of gods, similar to what we see in even Greek and Roman religion about different people at a table, how Christ literally organized apostles, a council of apostles. There's also multiple angels or beings appearing to a prophet to sort of signify that that prophet is legit, right? So
When you
yeah.
mentioned Heiser and his interpretation, but he's still critical of Mormonism, isn't he?
hmm Oh, he does not agree with us. He's an evangelical, but his work is used by Mormonism, by our by Latter Day Saints because it lines up, right? He doesn't believe in the Book of Mormon. He can believe Joe Smith was a con man and everything, but also, I mean, I don't know if he believes Joe Smith's a con man, but regardless, doctrine of gods in the Book of Abraham it does line up pretty nicely with what Michael Heiser teaches about God. So again, we have a rough relationship with the Christian world because they don't believe, they go, no, they're wrong, we don't buy what they're saying, but we kind of use their new scholarship because it does often support Mormon claims.
All right, so if God was not the original everything, does Mormonism give ultimate answers for everything, or is it just kind of like, so here's the last thing we know, which is there's this God, and then from there we know stuff, but we don't know anything before that?
Yeah, that's about it because uh I mean, the closest you can get is what we call esoteric doctrine, that we believe all of our spirits were created from what's called intelligence or spirit matter, sort of compact matter that was just existed before the world, and from that material, spirits were created. Um,
And that would include God?
uh, we assume. I mean, we're speaking that God, that Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother created us from compact spirit matter and created from that intelligence and then made spirits and then put the spirits in human bodies and then that created a soul. Um, but yeah, we don't really make the claim to define everything because, or this is where everything came from, because you can't even define everything without just using synonyms for everything, right? I mean, saying everything is like I can't define everything. I have no idea. To me, that seems like an unwinnable battle. But it's like, hey, we know about this God and what the plan is here and how we're going to get back to heaven to become like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said there. I think that one of the things I really like about science and that I don't like about classical theology is that they claim to know everything. They claim to have the ultimate answers and can just answer everything. And I think that's completely ridiculous. So I definitely think your position is a lot more reasonable in that sense for sure. But so if God wasn't the first thing, why do we call him God? Is he's just like you said, a super intelligent, super powerful thing beyond our scope, but it's not really a God in the classical sense as being the ultimate answer. So why do we call him God? Why do we worship the Mormon idea of a God?
So you'll find the most common term we use as Heavenly Father. Um, because we believe he's the father of our spirits, right? So we worship him because through his plan we can get back to heaven to become like him. So essentially, we believe that everyone existed before in heaven as spirit children of God. Um, but to become like God, to have power, you had to understand right and wrong. And there had to be sort of an understanding of reality and how things work. And so, because of that, we then came to earth, had to experience sin. We had to know good from evil. So, when we come back to heaven, we can have a better understanding of the universe and be prepared to be gods ourselves, essentially. Um, and so, we also believe that when you die, you cannot like there's an eternal law of justice, and there's eternal law that God subscribes to. So
Well, it subscribes to like so the eternal law of justice predates God, and God is subject to it.
yes, so yeah, there's an eternal law that was around even before our God was a God. So because of that, there's a law of justice, and because if you have been wicked or you've hurt people, you are then guilty, and so Christ, as the firstborn Son of God and a God Himself, came to die for our sins, and so it was sort of he purchased us, right? We were covered by His insurance, if you will, that if we follow Him and become disciples of Him, then we will not be defined by our sins, and then we can be resurrected and we can be exalted to be in heaven because of Christ. So I mean, yeah, it's really from the creation of our spirits to judgment day and resurrection. That's our religion, everything in there. Before our God was a God, we got a little bit about spirit matter, and we just
Morality.
say, yeah. But we it does for us, we don't have to know. Right? For us, we don't have to know who is before our God because we don't make that claim as something that needs to be revealed for our religion to be true, right? Um, so it's fun to talk about, but you won't if you go to Sunday school and a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you probably won't hear them talking about that.
Yeah, interesting. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed coming on. This was very informative, and I'm definitely going to look into more of the predictions you mentioned about the cities and the tombs and things, because that I'm a big guy about testable predictions, so those are definitely qualify as evidence if I can verify them. So yeah, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
No problem. When will this be up?
It's up right now. It's been live the whole time.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
so that
Well,
section where you just said Mormonism is false and converted to atheism, now everyone knows. Ah,
right. Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
yeah, absolutely. Talk to you later. Bye.